I met Fred one morning when he came into breakfast with my dad. We lived out on an oil lease, and Dad was the pumper on the lease, and he worked for the British American Oil Company, and that company was Fred's company also. So they sent him down to check on my dad, and so I saw him walking around on the lease with my dad and thought, I want to meet him. And he came into breakfast, and handsome, gum chewing, real smarty acting.
Cocky.
And I was just getting up, and I thought, oh my, I better hurry. I slipped on a dress, ran a comb through my hair, and went in and had breakfast with Mom and Dad and Fred. That night, he came after me where I was working. I was working at a drive-in, hopping cars for my college money. And he walked in and brought me home that night. Mom always came after. Laverne and I both worked at this drive-in. It was Mrs. King's drive-in, and it was a busy place for beer drinkers, but she served good food, and Laverne and I worked there for our college money. But Nanny was always parked out waiting for us to get through working. So that night, Nanny drove home by herself, and Fred took me home. And both of us knew that night that it would be a permanent arrangement. We talked about it later. He had gone through OU, was out about a year, I think, and he played football at OU and was quite the hero. About 3 years of football, making all the news, and he was engaged to this doctor's daughter from McAllister. And I was dating a boy. I had a high school sweetheart too, and he took off one weekend with another girl, and I said goodbye. And Fred's bride-to-be, or he thought, was she dated a lot with the banker's son, or the banker from McAllister, and she decided she would marry him because I think she thought she wanted to go on living in her hometown and didn't want to start chasing all over the country with this young petroleum engineer. So we were both freed from other mates.
Commitments.
Yeah. And we started dating in August, and we were married in January. And we were married in January, and Basil.
What year?
1937. And Basil had recently left the old school where we all went for years and moved to New London, and was going to school there. And on March the 18th, there was the big blast that destroyed the new school. And Basil was one of the victims.
And who's Basil? Who's Basil?
Basil was my 11-year-old baby brother. And I only had one sister, and Basil was our little brother. And my dad It was a real tragedy. I was at a ladies' church meeting right close to where we lived. We lived in a camp, British American camp, and I was at this ladies' meeting pretty close to the camp, and we heard this horrible noise and started wondering what it was. And my good friend, everybody knew that Pete Jones led the singing at the church where we went to, and everybody knew that Pete's son was at that school. So everybody, well, the word got into the group that there had been a terrible explosion at the New London school. So everybody was concerned about Pete's son. I can't remember his name. And they kind of cleared out and left me, and then I sat and thought, that's where Basil goes to school. And I don't remember how I got over to the camp, but Fred and I got word about the explosion, and we took off and started to where my folks lived, which was about 3 miles. And I'll never ever forget the noise that started after that blast. All night long. It took us about 2 hours to make that 3 miles to Mom and Dad's house, and the sirens wailed all night long that night. And it took us about 3 hours to get there. It was real slow going, but when we drove up in the yard, Dad was out in the yard, and his hair was blowing, and he was really,
Distraught.
yes, he was weeping, he was wringing his hands, and he had just come back from Overton. That's the nearest town where they lived. That was our address, at Overton, Texas. And he had found Basil. The churches were full. Every business was full of bodies, and there were surrounding towns were bringing their trucks and vehicles in to help find the kids and take them into the different places in Overton. And so that's the way we found Dad.
How many were killed? How many were killed?
There were 290, I think it was 296 were killed. And we had Basil's funeral on the porch of the little old house, the little lease house where Mom and Dad lived. There were so many funerals being conducted that all the funeral homes and churches and everything was full. So we had Basil's funeral on...
Tell us about Basil.
Basil was 11 years old, and he had just been at London school a year, but he got acquainted real quick. He was a cheerleader, and back at Leverage Chapel, where he went to all of his grade school years, he was in junior high when he got to New London. And back at Leverage Chapel, where he was in grade school, he was a real favorite. He played his violin all the time, and they would put him on assembly programs, and I can remember him playing Pop Goes the Weasel, and he would pop that string, and everybody would laugh. And Dad kept his hair cut so short that sometimes I think he shaved it. And he also took expression. And back then, it was called expression. Kids were taught to recite. And Basil had this cutest recitation. He came out on the stage in a pair of overalls and sat down on a bucket, and he said, "My aunt can't ever have enough water. She's always saying, 'Come and bring me some water. I need some water.' So I have to carry her water in the bucket." But it was real hard. It was real hard. My dad, he told Fred, we had all started going to the Turnertown Baptist Church, and that was a new thing for my dad. Fred got Basil in his Sunday school class, and Basil took a little friend, and they were baptized, and this impressed my dad, and he was baptized with Basil. And Dad's life changed dramatically. He was a pretty rough character. Sometimes he drank more than he should, and he would have a what do you call it? He wasn't an alcoholic, but he went on
Binges.
Hmm?
Binges.
Yeah, he'd have binges every once in a while. And, of course, we kids didn't like that, but he was always better on a binge. He would buy us anything he could think of, and he was quite a guy. But when Basil was killed, it just crushed him. And he told Fred, he said, "Fred, I don't understand God treating me like this." He said, "The first thing I've done that is good, is any good at all, I joined church, was baptized, and then the Lord took my son." He said, I don't understand that. And he never did. That was a real jar from our dad.